development of Shadow Ridge had been hailed as a fresh start for many. Nestled in a quiet corner of the United States, the new housing development offered an escape from the noise and bustle of larger cities. The real estate brochures painted a picturesque scene: wide open spaces, lush green lawns, and pristine homes for families looking to settle into suburban bliss. Yet beneath the carefully crafted image lay something sinister, something no one spoke of. The land on which Shadow Ridge was built had a history, one soaked in blood and anguish. It was the site of the Ridgeford Battle, a forgotten conflict from the Civil War, where hundreds of soldiers met a brutal end. Time had buried their stories, but not their pain. David Johnson, his wife Emily, and their young son Sam were among the first families to move into the development. Like many others, they were drawn in by the affordable prices and the promise of tranquility. Their new house stood at the end of a cul-de-sac, framed by a large backyard that stretched out towards the woods, which gave an eerie sense of isolation. David, a history buff, found the proximity to the old battlefield intriguing, but didn't think much of it. The land had been redeveloped after all. Whatever had happened here was long forgotten. At least, that's what he told himself. On their first night, something felt off. It wasn't something they could put into words, but there was a heaviness in the air, a sensation of being watched, though no one was there. The house creaked in a way that felt unnatural, as though the walls themselves were groaning under an invisible weight. The wind outside seemed to whisper, brushing against the windows with unsettling persistence. Around midnight, Sam woke up crying. He told David and Emily that he had heard footsteps, heavy, deliberate footsteps, outside his room. David brushed it off as new house jitters, the typical settling of a home, or maybe just a child's overactive imagination. But as he stood in the hallway outside Sam's room, listening closely, he heard it too. A steady, rhythmic march, as if someone was walking the corridor outside his son's door. Heart pounding, David opened the door to find the hallway empty. The sound stopped the moment he stepped out, leaving him questioning his own senses. He checked the front door, the back door, all the windows, everything was locked. There was no one else in the house. Emily tried to calm him, saying it was probably just the wind, but there was a look in her eyes, an unspoken fear that mirrored his own. Neither of them slept well that night. The next morning, David stepped outside into the backyard to shake off the unease from the previous night. The sky was a bright, clear blue, but the atmosphere still felt wrong. He walked towards the edge of the property, where a small plaque was nestled into the ground, marking the location of the Ridgeford Battle. He hadn't noticed it before. The words inscribed there seemed innocent enough, a brief mention of a skirmish that had taken place over 100 years ago. But standing there in the quiet of the early morning, he felt a chill run down his spine. There was something about the land, something lingering, as if the air itself was thick with memories, with trauma. That night, the footsteps returned. This time, they were louder, more insistent, and they weren't just confined to the hallway outside Sam's room. David and Emily could hear them echoing through the entire house. Marching, over and over again. The sound grew louder, as though the walls themselves were reverberating with each heavy step. David's heart raced as he leapt out of bed, running into the hallway, determined to catch whatever was causing it. But again, the moment he stepped out, silence. Nothing but the dim glow of the moon filtering through the windows. He walked slowly through the house, checking every room. In the living room, he stopped cold, his breath caught in his throat. Standing in the corner, barely visible in the shadows, was a figure, a soldier, his uniform tattered and smeared with dirt, his face a mask of torment. The figure didn't move, didn't acknowledge David's presence. It simply stood there, staring blankly ahead as if trapped in some horrible memory. David blinked, and the figure was gone. The terror began to settle in. As more families moved into Shadow Ridge, the unsettling occurrences became a shared, unspoken secret among the new residents. David Johnson wasn't the only one hearing things at night. His neighbor, and Jones, a woman in her 50s who had recently retired with her husband Paul, began experiencing strange phenomena almost immediately after moving in. At first, it was subtle, just faint sounds she couldn't quite place. like the rustling of leaves or distant whispers. But the whispers grew louder as the nights passed, always in a language she couldn't fully understand, though the tone was unmistakable: desperation, pain, and fear. One night, and woke up abruptly, heart pounding in her chest. She was sure she had heard someone talking right outside her bedroom window. It wasn't the typical murmur of wind or the house settling. It was clear, urgent, like a conversation happening just beyond the glass. She hesitated for a moment, fear clutching at her, before finally getting out of bed. Her husband Paul slept soundly beside her, oblivious to the strange sounds, and carefully pulled back the curtain, expecting to find nothing but the empty street illuminated by the moonlight. Instead, her blood turned to ice. Standing just outside her window was a soldier. His uniform was torn and stained with dirt and dried blood. His face, pale and gaunt, was partially obscured by a wide-brimmed hat, but she could see his eyes, dark, hollow, and filled with a sorrow she couldn't comprehend. He was staring directly at her, as though pleading for something, though his lips never moved. For what felt like an eternity, she was frozen in place, unable to move or even breathe. Then, in the blink of an eye, the soldier was gone, leaving behind nothing but the cold breeze blowing through the trees, and stumbled backward, her heart racing, her mind spinning with questions. Had she imagined it? Was it a trick of the light? She shook Paul awake, but by the time he groggily looked out the window, there was no trace of the spectral figure. She wanted to tell herself it had just been a nightmare, but deep down, she knew it wasn't. Something was very wrong in Shadow Ridge. The next morning, over coffee, and hesitated to share what she had seen. Paul was practical, logical, and she knew he'd brush off her fears as stress from the move. But when she casually mentioned hearing whispers in the night, to her surprise, Paul went quiet. He set down his coffee cup and admitted, in a low voice, that he had heard something too. Voices. Just a few nights ago, he dismissed it as his imagination, but now that and was mentioning it, he couldn't shake the feeling that something was truly off about the place. They both agreed to keep it to themselves for the time being, not wanting to alarm their neighbors, though the tension between them grew with each passing night. As the days went by, more incidents occurred. One night, and woke again, this time to the sound of footsteps, not outside her window, but inside the house. The slow, deliberate thud of boots echoed down the hallway. She sat up in bed, listening, her heart pounding in her chest. It was as though someone was walking through the house, but when she got up to check, no one was there. The floorboards creaked underfoot as she tiptoed through the dimly lit hallway. But the moment she reached the living room, the sound stopped. There was no sign of forced entry, no one hiding in the shadows. It was as if the house itself was alive with the memories of something long buried. And wasn't the only one. Over the next few weeks, other neighbors began sharing their own strange experiences. Quietly, cautiously, as though speaking about it too loudly would make it worse. One neighbor, Steve Matthews, reported seeing shadows moving in his backyard late at night, figures that seemed to march in a steady line across his lawn, only to vanish into thin air when he went to investigate. Another, Karen Williams, confided that she had woken up to find muddy boot prints trailing from her front door to the kitchen, though her house had been locked and no one had been inside. Everyone had a story, but no one could explain what was happening. The whispers continued for Anne. They grew louder, more insistent, as though whoever, or whatever, was speaking was desperate to be heard. She would sit in the living room late at night, staring out into the darkness, straining to make out the words. They were always just beyond comprehension, but the feeling behind them was unmistakable: anguish, suffering, and an overwhelming sense of loss. It was as if the land itself was haunted by the memories of the soldiers who had died there, and their spirits were trapped, reliving their final moments over and over again. One night, as she sat by the window and saw him again, the soldier. This time, he was standing in the middle of the street, his gaunt face turned up toward the sky. His uniform was even more tattered than before, his body covered in mud and what looked like dried blood. He wasn't alone. Behind him, more soldiers appeared, their figures barely visible in the dim light. but their presence undeniable. They stood there, silent and still, as though waiting for something. Anne's heart raced, her breath coming in shallow gasps. She knew now that what she had seen before wasn't a dream. These soldiers were real, or at least they had been, and whatever had happened to them on this land, it wasn't over. The next morning, Anne tried to talk to David Johnson. She needed to know if anyone else was seeing what she had seen, if these experiences were part of some shared nightmare. When she mentioned the figure in the yard, David's face grew pale. He, too, had seen something, but neither of them wanted to admit the truth. They were being haunted, not by a single ghost, but by an entire army of the dead. And whatever these soldiers wanted, they weren't going to stop until they made themselves known. David Johnson couldn't shake the growing sense of unease that had settled over Shadow Ridge. After hearing Anne Jones's story, he knew something more sinister was happening in their new neighborhood. The shadows, the whispers, the strange figures that people were seeing, there was too much for it to be just coincidence. Determined to find answers, David dove into research, hoping to uncover the truth about the land on which their homes were built. Late into the night, as Emily and Sam slept, David sat hunched over his laptop in the dim light of the kitchen. He had always been fascinated by history, and now his curiosity became desperation. He scoured old records, archives, and history websites, piecing together the dark past of Shadow Ridge. The land had once been the site of the Ridgeford Battle, a little-known but particularly brutal confrontation during the Civil War. Hundreds of soldiers, both Union and Confederate, had perished in a single day, their bodies left to rot on the battlefield as the war moved on. The land was soaked with blood and death, forgotten by most over the decades. But it hadn't been forgotten by the dead. David discovered something chilling. The Ridgeford Battle was notorious for its brutality and the chaos that had unfolded in its final moments. Soldiers who had survived the initial battle were trapped for days in a no-man's land between enemy lines, surrounded by the bodies of their fallen comrades. Many had died not from their wounds but from exposure, starvation, or the bitter cold. It was a slow, agonizing end for hundreds of men, and their spirits, it seemed, had never left. He read accounts from soldiers who had fought there, journal entries describing the horrific conditions, the cries of men begging for water, for mercy, for death to take them quickly. These cries, David realized with a sinking feeling, were the same voices they were hearing now. The voices that echoed through their homes at night weren't figments of their imagination. They were echoes of the past. The dead were still here, trapped in an endless loop, reliving their final moments of torment and suffering. As David absorbed the grim reality, he heard something, an unmistakable sound that sent a chill down his spine. Faint at first, but growing louder. The distant sound of marching, rhythmic and unrelenting, reverberating through the walls of the house. It was the same sound that had haunted them since their first night in Shadow Ridge, but now it felt closer, more tangible. David stood up slowly, his body tense with fear, and moved toward the hallway. The marching continued, louder now, as though a group of soldiers were advancing just outside their home. His hands trembled as he reached for the front door, half expecting to find a battalion of spectral figures standing on his lawn. But when he opened it, there was nothing, just the cool night air and the stillness of the neighborhood. Yet the sound persisted, as if it was inside the walls themselves. He could almost feel the weight of their boots pounding against the floor, the pressure of hundreds of feet moving in perfect unison. Sweat beaded on his forehead as he closed the door and turned back toward the living room. The air felt thick, oppressive, and charged with energy, an energy that didn't belong in the world of the living. Sam, their 8-year-old son, had been having his own strange experiences. He began speaking of men outside his window, soldiers who would march across the backyard at night, their faces blank, their eyes empty. At first, David and Emily thought it was just a child's imagination running wild. But after everything David had uncovered, he knew better. Sam wasn't imagining things. He was seeing what David had only heard in the darkness. The restless dead, doomed to wander the battlefield where they had died, forever trapped in their final moments. One night, Sam told David something that sent a jolt of terror through his heart. "They don't see me, Dad," Sam whispered, his eyes wide and distant, as though he was still staring at the figures outside. "They just keep walking over and over again, like they're stuck." David knelt beside his son, trying to mask the fear rising in his chest. "What do they look like, buddy?" Sam's voice was soft, almost matter-of-fact. "They're dirty. Their clothes are all ripped up, and they're sad, really sad." David swallowed hard, his mind racing. He tried to reassure Sam that everything was fine, that it was just a dream. But deep down, he knew his son was right. The soldiers weren't just passing through. They were stuck in time, reliving their deaths in an endless cycle. And now the Johnsons, and every other family in Shadow Ridge, were caught in the middle of it. As the days passed, the manifestations grew stronger. David began to hear the sounds of war, muffled gunfire, the clash of swords, and worst of all, the agonized cries of the dying. It started out faint, barely perceptible, but each night it grew louder, more vivid, until it felt like a full-scale battle was raging just outside their home. David tried to talk to Emily about it, but she was already at her breaking point. She hadn't slept in days, plagued by nightmares and waking visions of the battlefield. "I can hear them, David," she whispered one night, her voice trembling. "I can hear them dying. Every night. I hear them screaming for help, but there's nothing we can do. We can't stop it." That night, as they lay in bed, the noise became unbearable. It wasn't just footsteps or whispers anymore. It was the full horror of the Ridgeford battle playing out in real time. The sound of cannon fire rattled the windows, followed by the desperate shouts of men calling out in pain. The ground beneath them seemed to vibrate with the weight of the conflict, and David could almost feel the cold earth where the soldiers had fallen, their blood seeping into the soil. In the distance, through the haze of sleep and fear, David thought he could make out shapes, figures moving through the darkness outside their window. They were soldiers, just as Sam had described, walking in an endless loop, forever caught in the battle that had stolen their lives. David's heart raced as he realized the truth. They were not just hearing the past, they were living it. The battle was still happening, and they were trapped in the middle of it, with no way to escape the relentless march of the dead. As the oppressive atmosphere around Shadow Ridge grew more intense, David began to notice something disturbing about the neighborhood. It wasn't just the sounds of battle or the soldiers' apparitions that haunted them. It was the change in the people. The residents, once excited and full of life, now seemed drained, worn down by the invisible weight of the land's dark history. Conversations with neighbors were brief, their faces pale and eyes hollow, as though they were living under constant threat. Shadow Ridge had become a place of quiet dread, where every night brought a new wave of terror. David's friend and neighbor, Steve Matthews, had always been a skeptic, dismissing the strange events as stress or overactive imaginations. But even Steve couldn't ignore what was happening anymore. One evening, as David was checking his mailbox, Steve approached him, his face tight with fear. "David," he said in a low voice, glancing over his shoulder as if expecting someone, or something, to be watching. "I need to talk to you. It's about the soldiers." David's stomach twisted at the mention of the soldiers. He had hoped he wasn't the only one, but hearing someone else acknowledge it made the situation feel even more real. "You've seen them too?" David asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Steve nodded, his hands trembling. "Last night, I was out on my porch having a smoke. I saw them, a whole line of them, marching across the backyard like they were going to war. But it wasn't just that. I heard it, man. I heard the guns, the shouting, like there was a battle happening right outside my house." David's pulse quickened. "You heard it too?" Steve's face grew pale. "It's getting worse, isn't it?" David nodded solemnly. "It's not just us. And down the street has seen them. My son sees them every night now, walking through the backyard." Steve's eyes widened, his voice shaky. "It's not just visions anymore, David. Something's happening to us. I feel it, in the air, in the house. It's like they're not just here to haunt us. They want something." That night, David sat with Emily after putting Sam to bed. He hadn't told her everything Steve had said, but she could sense something was wrong. The two sat in silence for a long time before Emily spoke, her voice barely audible. Do you think they're here because of us? Because we built our homes on their graves? David rubbed his hands together, trying to shake the cold that had settled deep in his bones. I don't know, he admitted, but it's like they're reliving the battle over and over. They're stuck, and I don't think they're going to stop until... He hesitated, unsure of how to finish the thought. What did the soldiers want? Could they be reasoned with? Or were they doomed to haunt this land forever? Before Emily could respond, a loud bang echoed through the house, making them both jump. It was followed by another and another, heavy thuds that reverberated through the walls. The sound was unmistakable, the steady, rhythmic march of boots on wooden floors. They had heard it before, but tonight it was different, louder, more insistent. The sound came from everywhere at once, as though the walls themselves were haunted, filled with the footsteps of the long-dead soldiers. David stood up, his heart pounding. "Stay here," he whispered to Emily, though he wasn't sure why. What could he do? He wasn't facing an intruder he could scare off or a broken pipe he could fix. He was up against something far older, far more powerful, something that had lived and died on this land long before they had arrived. As he stepped into the hallway, the temperature dropped drastically. His breath misted in front of him, the cold biting into his skin. The marching grew louder, but when David reached the living room, it stopped suddenly, leaving only an eerie silence in its wake. He stood still, listening, his heart thundering in his chest. That's when he saw it. In the middle of the room, barely visible in the dim light, stood a figure, a soldier, just as Sam had described. His uniform was ragged, his face pale and streaked with dirt and blood. But this time, the soldier wasn't alone. Behind him, more figures began to materialize, one after the other, until the room was filled with a silent army. Their expressions were blank, their eyes hollow, as though they were trapped in some eternal nightmare, unaware of their surroundings. David's breath caught in his throat as the first soldier stepped forward, his boots echoing softly on the hardwood floor. The figure moved slowly, his head turning as if searching for something. His face, though lifeless, was etched with pain, with the horror of a death he couldn't escape. The other soldiers followed suit, their movements slow and deliberate, as though they were retracing the steps of their final march. Suddenly, one of the soldiers locked eyes with David. The room seemed to darken around them, the temperature plummeting even further. For a brief moment, David felt like he was being pulled into another time, another place, the battlefield. He could hear the distant roar of cannon fire, the cries of the wounded, the chaos of war swirling around him. The soldier's gaze was intense, filled with a deep, unrelenting sorrow. David's heart raced as he realized that the soldier was trying to communicate with him, but the words wouldn't come. Instead, the soldier's mouth moved soundlessly, his lips forming words that David couldn't hear. Then, as quickly as they had appeared, the soldiers began to fade, one by one, until only the first soldier remained. He stared at David for a long moment before disappearing into the shadows, leaving behind nothing but the faint echo of his final march. David stood frozen in place, his mind reeling. What had just happened? Were the soldiers trying to reach out, to tell him something? Or were they simply trapped, doomed to wander the land where they had died? He didn't know. But one thing was certain. Whatever was happening at Shadow Ridge was far from over. Later that night, David confided in Emily about what he had seen. "They're not just ghosts," he whispered, his voice shaking. "They're reliving something, and I think they're trying to show us what happened." Emily looked at him, fear etched in her features. "What do we do?" David shook his head. "I don't know, but we need to find out what they want before it's too late. I don't think they'll stop until they've finished what they started." The question lingered in the air, heavy with dread. What had the soldiers started, and why were they drawing the living into their endless nightmare? As the night stretched on, David couldn't shake the feeling that the answer lay buried in the bloody history of the Ridgeford battle, a history that was far from finished with them. The days following the soldiers' appearance were a blur of fear and uncertainty for David and Emily. The haunting presence of the soldiers lingered, casting an oppressive gloom over their home. The sounds of the battlefield, once faint echoes in the night, now seemed to invade every corner of their lives. It was no longer confined to darkness. The terror had seeped into the daylight. David became obsessed with uncovering the full truth about the Ridgeford battle. He spent hours at the local library, scouring through old war diaries, town records, and newspaper clippings, hoping to find anything that could explain why the dead soldiers were so relentless. His research led him to a small historical society in the nearby town of Ridgeville, where a woman named Mrs. Waverly, a local historian, knew more than anyone about the battle. On a dreary afternoon, David met Mrs. Waverly in the society's dimly lit archive room. She was an elderly woman with sharp eyes and a thin smile, someone who had lived in the area her entire life. She didn't seem surprised when David asked about the Ridgeford battle. "You're living out there, aren't you?" she asked, her voice low. "In the new homes they built over the old battlefield." David nodded, his pulse quickening. "Yes, and something's happening there. We're seeing things, hearing things." Mrs. Waverly's expression darkened. She leaned forward, her voice almost a whisper. "Those soldiers never left, Mr. Johnson. Their bodies were never properly buried. The battle wasn't just brutal, it was cursed. The men who fought there, they died in agony, abandoned by their commanders, left to rot under the open sky. And ever since then, there's been talk of hauntings, but not like the usual ghost stories. These soldiers are trapped, reliving their final moments over and over. It's as if the battle never ended for them." David's throat tightened. Why? Why haven't they moved on? Mrs. Waverly glanced around the room before continuing. "There's a legend tied to Ridgeford. It said that in the final days of the battle, as the fighting raged, a Confederate commander, Colonel Jacob Grayson, made a pact with something dark. He and his men were cornered, outnumbered, facing certain death. In his desperation, Grayson supposedly invoked a curse, calling upon dark forces to turn the tide in his favor." David felt a chill creep down his spine. "A curse?" Mrs. Waverly nodded gravely. "Some say Grayson was promised victory, but at a terrible cost. His men would rise again, doomed to fight for eternity. No one knows exactly what happened in those last hours, but the battle ended in slaughter. Hundreds of men died in agony, and their bodies were never recovered." David sat back, his mind racing. "And you think that's what's happening now? That we're seeing the result of this curse?" Mrs. Waverly fixed him with a stern look. "I don't think, Mr. Johnson, I know. And I'm afraid your family has moved on a cursed ground. The dead are trying to finish something, and until they do, no one will find peace." David left the historical society feeling more confused and terrified than ever. The idea of a curse, of a centuries-old pact made in desperation, sounded insane. But after everything he had seen and heard, he couldn't deny that something terrible had happened on that battlefield, and it was still unfolding. That night, as he sat in his home office, David couldn't shake the feeling that the soldiers were trying to tell him something. They had shown themselves to him, not as violent or malicious spirits, but as lost souls trapped in a cycle of endless suffering. He wondered if there was a way to break the curse to help them find peace. But how? The house was unusually quiet that evening. Emily had taken Sam to visit her sister, hoping to get some distance from the strange occurrences. David welcomed the solitude. It gave him time to think. But as the night grew darker, an unnatural stillness settled over the house, and a familiar sense of dread crept back into his mind. Around midnight, David heard it again, the marching. The steady, rhythmic sound of boots hitting the ground. Only this time, it wasn't faint or distant. It was right outside his window. His heart pounded in his chest as he stood up and cautiously approached the window, pulling the curtain back just enough to peer outside. What he saw chilled him to the core. A full regiment of soldiers stood in the backyard, their faces expressionless, their uniforms tattered and covered in dirt. They were the same soldiers who had appeared in his living room, but now there were more of them. Dozens, maybe hundreds. Their eyes were hollow, and their bodies were twisted with the anguish of their final moments. At the head of the regiment stood a tall, imposing figure, a man dressed in a Confederate officer's uniform, his face pale and gaunt, his eyes burning with an unnatural intensity. David's breath caught in his throat as he realized who it was. Colonel Jacob Grayson, The man from the legend, the commander who had cursed his men to an eternity of suffering. Grayson's eyes locked onto David's, and for a moment, time seemed to stand still. The air grew thick with tension, and David could feel the weight of the curse pressing down on him. Grayson raised his arm, pointing directly at David, his lips moving as though he were speaking, but no sound came. Still, David could feel the command, the desperation in the gesture. Grayson wasn't threatening him. He was pleading. The soldiers began to march forward, moving in eerie unison, their boots thudding against the earth. David's heart raced as he realized they were heading toward the house, toward him. Panic surged through him, and he stumbled back from the window, his mind spinning. What did Grayson want? What were the soldiers trying to communicate? As the sound of their marching grew louder, David bolted for the front door, his pulse thundering in his ears. He flung the door open and stepped outside, the cool night air hitting him like a shock. The soldiers were gone. The yard was empty, the street silent. It was as if they had never been there at all. But David knew better. He had felt their presence, had seen Grayson's silent plea. The dead weren't just reliving the past, they were trying to reach out. And somehow, David was at the center of it all. He stood there, breathing heavily, staring at the empty yard where moments ago an army of the dead had gathered. His mind raced with questions, with possibilities. If the curse was real, if Grayson and his men were bound to this land by some dark force, then there had to be a way to break it. But how could he, a man with no knowledge of the supernatural, possibly hope to end a centuries-old curse? And if he couldn't, what would happen to his family, to the other residents of Shadow Ridge, as the soldiers' torment continued to bleed into the present? As David stood in the stillness of the night, one thing became terrifyingly clear. The dead weren't just haunting Shadow Ridge. They were preparing for something far worse than he could imagine. And time was running out. David couldn't shake the terror that had settled deep within him after the night he saw Colonel Grayson and his ghostly regiment. The haunting visions and sounds that plagued the community were no longer just eerie occurrences. They were escalating, and now David understood why. The soldiers weren't aimlessly marching in the night. They were building towards something catastrophic. As dawn broke over Shadow Ridge, David knew he couldn't keep this to himself any longer. He had to warn the other residents, but the thought of approaching them with tales of cursed soldiers and a dark pact seemed insane. He needed proof, something tangible that would make people listen. His first thought was to call Steve, the only other person who had admitted to seeing the soldiers. Steve had become more withdrawn in recent days, barely answering calls or texts, but David knew he had to try. When Steve didn't answer his phone, David decided to drive over to his house. As he pulled into Steve's driveway, he noticed how eerily quiet the neighborhood had become. There was no sign of life, no children playing, no neighbors tending to their lawns. The entire community felt like a ghost town, drained of all vitality. It was as though the haunting presence of the soldiers had leached away the living energy of Shadow Ridge. David knocked on Steve's door, the hollow sound echoing through the stillness. After a few moments, the door creaked open slightly, revealing Steve's haggard face. He looked worse than before, his skin pale and eyes sunken, as though he hadn't slept in days. "Steve," David said, keeping his voice low, "we need to talk. It's getting worse. I think the soldiers are building up to something. I saw them again last night. There were more of them." Grayson was there. Steve's face tightened at the mention of the name. He opened the door wider, gesturing for David to come inside. The house was dark, and the air inside felt thick and heavy, as though it were infused with the same sense of dread that hung over the entire neighborhood. "You're not the only one," Steve said quietly as he slumped into a chair. "I've seen them too. More of them. Marching. But it's not just the soldiers anymore." David's heart skipped a beat. "What do you mean?" Steve's eyes darted around the room, his voice barely above a whisper. "I've started seeing them. The others. People from the neighborhood, David. People we know. It's like they're joining the soldiers." David felt a cold chill run down his spine. "What do you mean, joining the soldiers?" Steve's hands trembled as he spoke. "Last night, I saw Mr. Thompson from 2 doors down. He was just standing there in his front yard. staring into the distance like he was waiting for something. Then a soldier walked up to him, and Thompson, he followed him. He walked right into the woods behind his house, without saying a word. It was like he was in a trance. David's stomach turned as he realized the horrifying implications. The soldiers weren't just reliving their battle. They were gathering the living. Did you see what happened to him? Where they went? Steve shook his head. I didn't dare follow. I just watched them disappear into the woods. But I've seen others too. Mrs. Green, she's been acting strange. I saw her standing at her window last night, just staring out like she was waiting for something. David's mind raced as he tried to make sense of it all. The curse was spreading. The soldiers were no longer content to march alone. They were taking the living with them, pulling them into their endless nightmare. But why? What were they preparing for? We need to stop this, David said firmly. There's something tying them to this land. Grayson's curse, the battle, something. If we can find out how it all started, maybe we can end it. Steve looked doubtful. And how do you propose we do that, David? These are ghosts. Soldiers from a war that's been over for centuries. What makes you think we can stop them? David didn't have an answer, but he knew he couldn't stand by and do nothing. I've been researching the battle, and there's a connection. Grayson made a pact, a curse that bound his men to this land. But there's something else, something I missed before. There's an old graveyard just outside the development. It's overgrown, barely even marked on the map. That's where they buried the bodies of the soldiers after the battle. Steve's eyes widened. You think the curse is tied to the graveyard? David nodded. I think it's more than just a battlefield. It's where the dead were abandoned. Their bodies were never given a proper burial. They were left to rot, forgotten. If we can find that graveyard, maybe we can find a way to put them to rest. Steve hesitated for a moment, his fear palpable, but then he nodded slowly. All right, but we need to hurry. I don't know how much time we have before whatever's happening reaches its peak. That evening, David and Steve set out to find the graveyard. Armed with flashlights and a vague map David had pieced together from Old Town records, they ventured into the woods behind Shadow Ridge. The air was thick with fog, and the towering trees cast long, eerie shadows as they made their way deeper into the forest. As they walked, the oppressive feeling of being watched grew stronger. Every snap of a twig or rustle of leaves made them jump, their nerves already frayed from the unrelenting terror of the past few weeks. David couldn't shake the feeling that they weren't alone, that the soldiers, or something worse, was following them. After what felt like hours of walking, they finally found it, a clearing in the woods where the overgrown remnants of a graveyard lay. The headstones were cracked and weathered, some barely visible beneath the thick underbrush. The air here was colder, heavier, as though the very ground was weighed down by the spirits of the dead. David's flashlight flickered as he approached one of the gravestones, brushing away the dirt and leaves to reveal a name: Colonel Jacob Grayson. His heart pounded as he realized they had found the resting place of the man who had cursed them all. "This is it," David whispered. "This is where it all began." But before they could take another step, the sound of marching boots echoed through the trees. The soldiers had found them. Emerging from the shadows, a line of spectral figures, their faces blank and hollow, stepped into the clearing, led by the same tall, imposing figure, Colonel Grayson. David and Steve stood frozen as the ghostly soldiers closed in around them, the oppressive weight of their presence suffocating. Grayson's cold, dead eyes fixed on David, and once again, his lips moved in silence, forming words David couldn't hear. But this time, David understood. Grayson wasn't threatening him. He was begging. The dead commander's eyes were filled with sorrow, with a silent plea for release from the endless torment. The soldiers stood still, their forms barely visible in the thickening fog, as Grayson reached out a hand toward David. David's mind raced. They had found the graveyard, but how could they break the curse? What did the dead want from him? Grayson's gaze burned into David's soul, and suddenly he understood. The soldiers were waiting for one thing, for someone to acknowledge their suffering, to give them the peace they had been denied for so long. They needed closure, a proper burial, a recognition of the lives they had lost, the sacrifices they had made. But as the spectral army stood in front of him, David realized the truth was far more complicated than he had anticipated, and breaking the curse wouldn't be as simple as he had hoped. There was a darker force at work here, one that went beyond the soldiers' suffering. And if he and Steve couldn't figure out how to stop it soon, Shadow Ridge would fall, along with everyone in it. The graveyard was shrouded in an oppressive silence as the spectral soldiers surrounded David and Steve. Colonel Grayson's hollow eyes bore into David's, and the weight of the dead commander's unspoken plea pressed down on him. The atmosphere was thick with despair, and for a moment, it felt like time itself had come to a halt, as if the world outside the graveyard no longer existed. Steve stood paralyzed beside David, the fear in his eyes unmistakable. He was trembling, and David could feel the same icy grip of terror constricting his own chest. The soldiers were waiting for something neither of them fully understood. David's mind raced. They had found Grayson's grave, the place where the dead had been forgotten, left to rot in anonymity. But what now? They couldn't fight ghosts. There had to be a way to release these tormented souls from their endless cycle, to stop them from dragging the living into their cursed nightmare. Grayson's form flickered slightly, as if the very fabric of his existence was unraveling. His gaze was still locked on David, pleading, desperate. And then, in a moment of clarity, David understood. These soldiers had been betrayed, not just by their commanders, but by time itself. Their pain had been forgotten, their sacrifices ignored. They need to be remembered, David whispered, the realization sinking in. They need their story told. That's why they can't move on. They're trapped because no one remembers what they went through. The curse isn't just about Grayson's pact. It's about their abandonment. Steve turned to him, his face pale with fear and confusion. What are you talking about? How are we supposed to remember them? How is that going to stop any of this? David stepped forward, his eyes fixed on Grayson. The dead commander watched him closely, the flickering soldiers around him eerily still, as if waiting for something to break the silence. David spoke softly, his voice trembling but steady enough to be heard. You died here, you and your men, forgotten by your country, by history. But we haven't forgotten. We know what happened, and we will make sure the world knows too. You're not just ghosts. You were soldiers. You gave everything, and you were abandoned. Grayson's form flickered again, but this time there was a change. His expression, once filled with anger and desperation, softened ever so slightly, as though David's words had resonated with something deep inside him. But the silence was shattered by the sudden rustling of leaves, the sound of something moving in the dense woods behind them. Steve and David turned sharply, their flashlights catching brief glimpses of movement. A figure emerged from the shadows, stumbling through the underbrush with an unnatural, jerking motion. It was Mr. Thompson. David's heart pounded as he recognized the man from down the street, the neighbor Steve had told him about. But something was horribly wrong. Thompson's eyes were vacant, his face slack as he moved toward them with stiff, robotic movements. Behind him, more figures appeared, other residents of Shadow Ridge, all with the same glassy stares, their bodies moving as if they were being pulled by invisible strings. They're coming, Steve whispered, backing away in horror. What are they doing? David's mind spun. The dead weren't just trapped in their own torment. They were pulling the living into their nightmare. Grayson and his soldiers weren't the only ones cursed. The land itself was poisoned, and now the living were becoming part of the army of the damned. David's gaze snapped back to Grayson, who stood silently watching the unfolding horror. Stop this, David shouted. You've gotten your vengeance. You've made us remember, but you can't take them too. They don't belong here. But Grayson didn't move. His expression was unreadable, his body still flickering, as if on the verge of disappearing entirely. It was then that David realized the truth. Grayson wasn't in control. He had never been. The curse had grown beyond his influence, beyond the soldiers' suffering. There was something else. The air around them grew colder, the fog thickening to the point where David could barely see the outlines of the soldiers anymore. The figures of Thompson and the other residents grew closer, their movements slow but unrelenting, their blank eyes fixed on David and Steve. David's pulse quickened as he realized they were out of time. They couldn't break the curse just by remembering. There was another force at play, something darker, more ancient than even the battlefield's bloody history. "We need to go," Steve whispered urgently, tugging at David's sleeve. "We can't fight this. We need to get out of here." But David couldn't tear his eyes away from Grayson, from the silent plea that still lingered in the dead commander's gaze. "It's not Grayson," David muttered, more to himself than to Steve. "It's the land. There's something in the land itself. It's feeding on them. On all of us." Steve looked at him like he'd lost his mind. "David, come on. We can't stay here." The fog swirled thicker, and suddenly, David heard something new whispers. Faint at first, but growing louder, more insistent. They weren't coming from Grayson or his soldiers, nor from the residents who were now mere feet away. They were coming from the earth itself, from the graves that lay forgotten beneath the soil. The voices of the dead. David's breath hitched as the whispers filled his mind, incoherent, yet undeniably malevolent. The curse wasn't just about the soldiers or their battle. Something far more sinister had been buried beneath this land, long before the Civil War. Grayson's pact had awakened it, and now it was claiming everything it could, living and dead alike. The figures of Thompson and the other residents were nearly upon them now, their lifeless eyes boring into David's as they shuffled closer. Panic surged through him, and in that moment, he knew there was no stopping what was coming. "We have to get out of here," David said, his voice shaking. "We can't stop it. Not like this." Without waiting for a response, David turned and bolted, dragging Steve with him. They sprinted through the fog-shrouded woods, the sound of rustling leaves and breaking branches echoing behind them. The whispers grew louder, chasing them through the trees, urging them to stop, to give in, to join the dead in their endless torment. But David didn't stop. He couldn't. They burst through the edge of the woods and into the open, gasping for breath, the whispers still echoing in their minds. The graveyard and its army of the damned were now hidden behind the thick veil of fog, but David knew they were still there, waiting, watching. Steve collapsed onto the ground, panting heavily. What the hell was that?" he asked, his voice trembling. David shook his head, wiping sweat from his brow. "It's not just the soldiers," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "There's something older, something worse, and it's waking up." Steve stared at him, wide-eyed and terrified. "What do we do now?" David looked back toward the woods, the fog still swirling in the distance. "We have to leave, Steve. We have to leave Shadow Ridge. The soldiers aren't the only ones trapped here. If we stay, we'll be next." As the cold night air pressed in around them, David realized that they had only scratched the surface of the horror that lay beneath Shadow Ridge. The battle between the living and the dead was far from over, and whatever darkness had been unleashed was only just beginning to awaken. As dawn broke over Shadow Ridge, David and Steve stood on the edge of the woods, breathless and trembling. The haunting whispers that had chased them out of the forest still echoed in their minds, and the fog that cloaked the graveyard seemed to reach out like ghostly fingers, threatening to pull them back into the darkness. But they were alive. For now. David's heart pounded in his chest as the reality of their situation began to sink in. The soldiers were not the true danger. They were victims, trapped in an eternal loop of suffering. But the real evil lay beneath the surface, something ancient and malevolent, feeding on the land itself. It had been awakened by Colonel Grayson's curse and was now spreading, claiming the souls of both the living and the dead. "We have to leave," David repeated, his voice barely audible over the oppressive silence that had settled over the neighborhood. "If we stay here, we'll be next." Steve nodded, his face pale with fear. "But what about the others? They're already gone. Mr. Thompson, Mrs. Green, they're part of it now." David's stomach twisted at the thought. His neighbors, people he had known and spoken to, were no longer themselves. They had been taken by whatever dark force had poisoned the land. But there was nothing they could do for them now. If they didn't leave soon, they too would fall victim to the curse. They quickly made their way back to Steve's house, where the streets of Shadow Ridge were eerily quiet. The once bustling community felt abandoned, the life drained from it, as if the very air had grown stale and lifeless. David could feel the weight of the dead watching them, unseen but ever present. As they reached Steve's driveway, the ground beneath them seemed to tremble, a faint rumble that sent a jolt of panic through David's veins. He exchanged a glance with Steve, both of them realizing that whatever was happening beneath the surface was gaining momentum. "We need to pack up," David said urgently. "Grab whatever you can carry and meet me at my place. We leave in 20 minutes. Steve nodded, disappearing into his house as David hurried back to his own. The ticking clock in his mind grew louder with every step. Time was running out, and the darkness that had taken over Shadow Ridge was closing in. He rushed into his home, throwing clothes and essentials into a duffel bag, his hands shaking as he tried to focus. But his thoughts were consumed by the haunting images of Colonel Grayson and his soldiers, of Mr. Thompson's lifeless eyes, and the whispers that seemed to claw at his soul. As he zipped up his bag, something strange happened. The air in the house grew thick, and a sudden chill settled over him. David froze, his heart racing as he heard it. Faint at first, then growing louder. Footsteps, heavy, deliberate, and unmistakable. They were coming. David turned slowly, his breath catching in his throat. Standing in the doorway was Colonel Grayson. His figure was translucent, but the malevolence that radiated from him was palpable. His spectral soldiers stood behind him, their hollow eyes fixed on David, silent and unrelenting. Grayson's expression was filled with sorrow, but also with a grim sense of inevitability. David took a step back, his back hitting the wall as his mind raced. He had to get out, had to run, but his feet felt rooted to the ground. Grayson moved forward, his ghostly form flickering, and for a brief moment, David saw the man behind the curse, the broken soul trapped in an endless nightmare, begging for release. "You can't stay here," Grayson whispered, his voice cold and distant. "It's too late." David's pulse quickened. "What do you want?" he asked, his voice trembling. "Why are you doing this?" Grayson's eyes were filled with regret, a haunting sadness that seemed to stretch beyond time itself. "It's not me," he said. "I never wanted this." David's heart pounded as the room seemed to darken, shadows stretching across the walls. The soldiers behind Grayson stood still, their faces frozen in the agony of their final moments. "It's the land," Grayson continued, his voice barely above a whisper. "The battle, the bloodshed, it poisoned this place. And now it feeds." David's stomach twisted with fear. "What do you mean? What is it?" Grayson shook his head, his form flickering as if he were fading in and out of existence. "Something older, something ancient. It was here long before us, before the war. We disturbed it when we died here, when we spilled blood on its soil. It feeds on suffering, on fear. We gave it what it wanted." David's breath caught in his throat. The curse wasn't just about the soldiers. It was about the land itself, something buried deep beneath the battlefield, waiting to be awakened. Grayson and his men had unknowingly unleashed it when they died here, and now it was consuming everything in its path. "You have to leave," Grayson said, his voice urgent. "It won't stop. It will take everyone, living and dead. It's too late for us, but not for you." The room seemed to pulse with darkness, and David could feel the malevolent force closing in, the weight of centuries of suffering pressing down on him. He had to get out, now. Without another word, David grabbed his bag and bolted for the door, his heart pounding in his chest. As he ran down the stairs, he could hear the whispers again, growing louder, more insistent. They weren't just coming from the soldiers. They were coming from the land itself, from the very earth beneath his feet. He burst out of the house, the cool morning air hitting his face as he sprinted across the yard. Steve was already waiting by his car, his face pale with fear. "Let's go," David shouted, throwing his bag into the back seat as he jumped into the passenger seat. Steve didn't need to be told twice. He started the engine, the car roaring to life as they sped down the empty streets of Shadow Ridge. The fog still lingered in the distance, thick and impenetrable, but David knew they had to get as far away as possible. As they drove, David glanced in the rearview mirror, his heart pounding as he saw the faint outlines of figures standing in the fog. The soldiers were watching, their spectral forms barely visible in the haze. And standing at the forefront, his eyes filled with sorrow and regret, was Colonel Grayson. David tore his gaze away from the mirror, his mind racing. They had escaped for now, but the darkness that had taken over Shadow Ridge wasn't confined to the battlefield. It was spreading, and it wouldn't stop until it consumed everything. "We can't outrun this," Steve said, his voice shaky as he gripped the steering wheel. "It's not going to let us go." David's stomach twisted with fear. He knew Steve was right. The malevolent force that had claimed Shadow Ridge wasn't finished with them. It was only a matter of time before it found them again. But for now, they were alive, and as the sun began to rise over the horizon, casting an eerie light over the desolate landscape, David made a silent vow. They wouldn't be forgotten. The soldiers, the people of Shadow Ridge, they deserved peace. And somehow, he would find a way to stop the darkness before it spread any further. But deep down, he knew the battle was far from over. And the whispers, they would never stop.